We signed the divorce papers with calm hands and polite smiles. No drama, no shouting, just silence. I thought we ended things peacefully, until I found the letter she left behind. What I discovered shattered everything I thought I knew about our marriage, and the truth didn't just change the past, it changed my entire future. I never thought I'd be the kind of man who looked back at his marriage and wondered how he could have missed all the signs. How he could have sat in the same room with someone for years, eating breakfast together, folding laundry, sharing a bed, and still not seen the truth until it was too late. But that's exactly where I found myself, staring at the signature on the divorce papers. Her handwriting neat, composed, unshaken, like she had already grieved and moved on, while I was still trying to understand how we even got to the point of unraveling. Because it wasn't dramatic. There was no yelling or betrayal or some big scandal that forced our hands. It was quiet. Too quiet, like two people slowly realizing that their silences had become more comfortable than their conversations. And I remember how she looked that morning at the courthouse, wearing the navy blue coat I got her for Christmas 3 years ago. The one she said made her feel like herself, her lips pressed into a tight smile as if trying to make this easier for both of us. And I did the same, because I thought that was what grown-ups did. We shook hands with pain and wished each other well, even if our hearts were breaking. And I genuinely believed we were partying with kindness, with dignity, with this strange, respectful love still lingering in the air. And maybe that's why it hurt more, because I didn't see it coming. I didn't expect the quiet to be hiding anything. I thought we had simply run out of us and were mature enough to let go. But in the weeks after she left, after the boxers were moved out and the keys returned and her scent slowly faded from the hallway and the pillows in the corners of the bathroom mirror where she used to write little messages in the steam, I started to feel something wasn't right. Not suspicious at first, just unsettled, like I'd forgotten something important, or like I was waking up from a dream that ended too abruptly. And I tried to push through it by getting back to routine, waking up early, going for runs, clearing out the fridge of all the almond milk and tofu I used to stock for her, and catching up with friends who were all a little too relieved to have me back, as if my marriage had quietly pulled me away from them, and no one wanted to say it while we were together. But now they were full of jokes and beers and awkward suggestions that I try dating again, and I laughed along even though it felt wrong, like I was betraying something I hadn't finished mourning. And maybe it was in one of those moments, when I was scrolling through our old photos late at night, that I realized just how carefully she had erased herself from my world, not in a cruel way, but in a deliberate one, like she had planned this ending for a while, giving back every book, every sweater, every memento I ever gave her except for one photo of us at a beach in Portugal. And it struck me as odd because she loved that trip but hated how she looked in that picture, so why take it? Why keep only that? And that's when I started looking closer, not because I wanted to dig up something, but because my gut wouldn't let me rest. And I remembered how during the last few months she would go on these long walks alone, saying she needed air, and how sometimes she'd come home with this dazed look in her eyes. And I'd ask if she was okay, and she'd smile and say she was just tired. And I believed her, because I trusted her, because she never gave me a reason not to. And even in our therapy sessions, she never blamed me for anything specific, just said we were drifting, like two boats, in different currents. And I accepted that. But now the pieces started to feel like they belonged to a different puzzle entirely, and one day, while I was going through an old drawer she used to keep locked, a drawer I never cared to check before because I respected her privacy, I found the key taped to the underside of her jewelry box, and inside was a small journal, just a plain leather-bound book with no title, no decoration, and I hesitated for a long time before opening it, because part of me felt like I was crossing a line, even after everything, but curiosity won, and when I flipped through the first few pages, it was just poems, sketches, thoughts about life, her usual creative outlet, but tucked in the middle, like something carefully hidden but begging to be found, was a folded letter addressed not to me, but to the one I never told, and my heart stopped, because I knew then that whatever piece I thought we had parted with was a lie, or at least incomplete, and with shaking hands I opened it, not knowing what I was hoping to find, but certain that nothing would be the same after I did. The moment my eyes scanned the first few lines of that letter, it felt like the floor beneath me gave way, like I had been standing on solid ground for years, that had actually been thin glass, and with one truth, one carefully written sentence, it all shattered, because the letter wasn't just some vague confession or poetic goodbye. It was a raw, unfiltered, emotional revelation of something she had buried so deep inside herself that even I, the man who once knew the rhythm of her breathing, who memorized the freckles across her shoulders, who kissed her forehead every morning, hadn't seen it coming. And it began with her saying that she had carried this secret through the last year of our marriage, waking up beside me with it pounding in her chest like a second heartbeat, unsure whether to tell me or protect me from it, unsure whether to hold on to hope or let it die quietly. And as I read further, I found out that she had been pregnant, not years ago, not before we met, but recently, during a time when we were already falling apart, when our conversations had grown sparse and our touches were more habit than intimacy, And she wrote that she hadn't known how to tell me because she wasn't even sure if I would want the baby. Not because I was cruel or careless, but because I had once said in a moment of exhaustion that I wasn't sure I was ready for fatherhood, that I feared becoming my own father, cold and distant. And even though I didn't mean it like that, even though I had forgotten the words the minute I said them, she hadn't. They stuck to her like glue, and she held on to them like a verdict. So when she found out she was pregnant, she panicked. And by the time she gathered the courage to tell me, things between us were so fragile that she convinced herself it was better to let it go, to carry the weight alone. And I kept reading, my hands trembling, my breath coming in short gasps, because she wrote about losing the baby in her second trimester, quietly, without fanfare or ceremony. Just a night of unbearable pain and blood and heartbreak while I was away on a work trip, texting her goodnight from a hotel room, not knowing she was on the bathroom floor, holding the ending of something I never even knew had begun. And she didn't call me, didn't go to the hospital. She just endured it, wrapped in silence. And when I came back, she was pale and distant, but I thought it was just us. Thought it was the slow crumbling of our connection, never realizing that she was grieving alone while pretending to still be my wife. And it broke something in me, something I didn't know was still breakable, because all those nights I lay beside her wondering if we were still in love. She was drowning in a storm I didn't even see, and now the idea of a child, our child, that could have been, that should have been, lived only in her handwriting, in a letter folded 3 times and hidden away like a sin. And part of me wanted to scream, to find her and ask why she didn't trust me enough to share the most painful moment of her life. But the other part, the one still clinging to love, knew why, knew that I had drifted too far, been too wrapped up in my own detachment to notice that she was slipping away. And the guilt hit me like a wave, drowning out my anger, replacing it with shame. Because how do you mourn something you never knew existed? How do you forgive someone for protecting you from your own child? And I sat there for what felt like hours, rereading the letter until the words blurred, until my eyes dried out and my chest ached from holding in everything I didn't know how to feel. And the days after that were a haze, like living in a memory that wasn't mine but haunted me anyway. And I started remembering things differently, like the time she refused wine at a dinner party and said she was on antibiotics. Or how she wore looser clothes that winter and I never questioned it. Or the way she once stood in the doorway of the nursery we never finished painting, touching the frame like it was sacred. And I hated myself for not seeing it, for not asking, more for not being the kind of man who would have fought to understand. And I didn't know what to do with this new truth, this version of our story that had been edited in her silence. So I did something stupid, something impulsive. I called her, and when she answered, her voice calm and cautious, I froze, not knowing what to say, so I just blurted it out. I found the letter, and the silence that followed was unlike any silence we had shared before. Not angry or bitter, just full of grief and inevitability. And she didn't deny it, didn't try to explain or defend herself. She just whispered, "I didn't want you to hate me," and those words broke me, because I never could. I never would, and I told her that. Told her I wished I had known. Told her I would have been there, that she should have let me decide for myself whether I was ready. And she cried, not loud or dramatic, just this soft, broken sound that made me want to reach through the phone and hold her like I used to. And she said, "It doesn't matter now, does it?" And maybe she was right. Maybe the past is fixed and unforgiving. But to me it did matter. It mattered more than anything. And I asked her if she still thought about it, about what could have been. And she said, "Every day." And I said, "Me, too." Even though I had only known for 2 days, because it already felt like I had carried the weight forever. And then she said something that twisted the knife deeper. She said, "That's not the only secret I left with." And before I could even respond, she said she had to go, that her husband was home. And just like that, the line went dead. And I was left staring at the phone, heart pounding, knowing that the story I thought had ended was only just beginning. And there was more she hadn't told me, more she had buried. And I didn't know if I could handle it, but I knew I had to find out. Because peace wasn't enough anymore, not when the truth had teeth. After the call ended, I sat in silence. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but unbearably full. Like every breath you take is too loud, too sharp. Like it's echoing off memories you're no longer sure were ever real. And my hands wouldn't stop shaking, my mind circling around her final words. "That's not the only secret I left with," like a haunting refrain. Taunting me, daring me to dig deeper, to destroy whatever illusion of peace we had left. And I tried to convince myself to let it go, to close the journal and shove it back in the drawer, to pretend that the letter was the end of it. That the pain I felt was just delayed grief, and not the beginning of something worse. But the truth is, curiosity is cruel when it's wrapped in love. And love doesn't die just because the marriage does. So I found myself walking around the city aimlessly, trying to think, trying to remember every conversation, every moment, that might have hinted at what else she was hiding. And it wasn't long before my thoughts turned obsessive, irrational even, replaying our last months together like I was combing through a crime scene for evidence I had missed. And I started wondering about the man she was with now. The husband she mentioned so casually, like it wasn't the emotional equivalent of a car crash for me to hear it. And I hated that I didn't know who he was, how they met, when they got married, whether he knew everything I didn't, whether he got the version of her who didn't flinch at the thought of becoming a mother, or if he too was living in blissful ignorance. And so, despite knowing it was pathetic, I started searching, scrolling through her social media, which had gone private right after the divorce. And I cursed myself for not taking screenshots when I still had access. But I remembered she had a blog once. Something small, mostly poetry and photos. And to my surprise, it was still up, still active, still painted in soft colors and cryptic words. And on the second page, I found a post titled, "The One Who Knew Me Before," and it wasn't long, just a few lines, but it ripped through me. Like glass, I carried a part of you into the future, even when I had to let go of your hand, and below it, a picture of her standing in front of a small white house, with a man I didn't recognize. His hand resting gently on her lower back, the way I used to touch her when we were out, like she was my compass, and I hated him for it. Not because he did anything wrong, but because he wasn't me. Because he got to be there now, beside her, inside her story, while I was stuck in the margins trying to decipher the footnotes. And it was then I realized I had no closure. That peaceful divorces were a myth because someone always leaves with more than the other, and I needed to talk to her again, needed to hear it from her mouth, what else she had locked away. So I called her again, twice, 3 times, and finally she picked up, her voice guarded now, like she expected this. Like she knew I wouldn't be able to leave it alone, and I asked her, calmly at first, what the hell she meant by not the only secret, and she sighed. This long, heavy sigh that felt like a lifetime, and said, "You need to let it go," but I couldn't. Not when I was spiraling, not when the truth was so close. And finally she said, "Fine, but you're not going to like it," and I told her I didn't care, I just needed to know, and she said she would meet me, just once, at a cafe near the park we used to walk through on Sundays. And when I saw her again, something inside me fractured. Not because she looked different, in fact, she looked almost exactly the same. Same calm eyes, same way of tucking her hair behind her ear when she was nervous, but because I didn't. I had aged. I could feel it in my bones, in the exhaustion behind my eyes. And we sat across from each other like strangers holding memories instead of hands. And after a few minutes of silence, I asked, and she nodded, slowly, like each movement was peeling back scar tissue. And she told me that after the miscarriage, after all the pain and confusion, she had gone to therapy, alone. And there she realized something she'd been hiding from herself for years, that she had been in love with someone else for a long time, not during the whole marriage, but toward the end, when we were slipping apart. And I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to imagine her giving her heart to someone else, while I was still trying to hold on to the scraps of ours. But she said it wasn't physical, not at first, it was emotional. It was talking to someone who made her feel seen again, someone who reminded her she was still allowed to want joy, and that after we separated, they reconnected. And that man, that person who wasn't me, was now her husband. And I sat there, stunned, because it wasn't the betrayal that crushed me. It was the confirmation that I hadn't been enough. Not even in the final months, not even as she grieved our unborn child. She had reached out to someone else, and I wanted to hate her, to rage, to demand how she could be so composed while unraveling my entire understanding of our ending. But I couldn't, because her eyes were full of remorse. Not guilt, just deep, aching sorrow. And I knew she hadn't done this to hurt me. She had done it to survive. And I asked her why she didn't tell me, why she let me believe our marriage had just withered away. And she said, "Because I didn't want to ruin your memory of it." And that's when I lost it, quietly, with my hands over my face. Because it wasn't fair. None of it was fair. And when I finally looked at her again, she reached across the table, touched my hand, and said, "I'm sorry." And I believed her. I truly did. But sorry doesn't bring back time, doesn't unwrite secrets. And I left the cafe that day with a storm inside me, knowing now that our divorce had never been peaceful. It had just been unfinished, and I didn't know what to do with that knowledge. Didn't know how to carry a truth that was heavier than the silence we left behind, and yet somehow, I knew there was still more. Because as I walked away, she called out to me, just one word, "Wait." And when I turned around, she said, "There's one last thing." And in that moment, I realized the truth I had uncovered was only the beginning, and the final secret would be the one to change everything I thought I knew, not just about her, but about myself. When she said, "There's one last thing," I stopped breathing for a second, caught in the gravity of that sentence, because I thought I had already unraveled everything, had already hit the bottom of the well. But her voice, quiet and trembling, told me otherwise, and I turned back toward her slowly, heart racing in a rhythm I didn't recognize, like my body already knew what my mind couldn't begin to imagine. And she motioned for me to sit back down, which I did, mechanically, without thinking, my legs weak and numb. And she looked at me with those eyes I used to think I understood better than anyone, eyes that once held laughter, fatigue, and soft wonder, now carrying something else entirely, fear, maybe, or guilt that had fermented into something heavier. And she took a shaky breath and said, "It wasn't just the miscarriage I didn't tell you about." And I blinked, stunned, confused, because I didn't understand how there could be more. and then she said, there were two, and it took me a moment to register what that meant, and I said, what do you mean, two? And she nodded slowly, her lips trembling now, and whispered, I got pregnant again, after the miscarriage, and I didn't tell you. I couldn't, because I was already seeing him, and I didn't know whose it was, and I sat there, the world spinning off its axis, because this was not the story I thought I was in, not the clean cut of grief I had been trying to bandage, but something messier, something raw and bleeding and impossible to categorize. And she told me she found out a few weeks before the divorce was finalized, and by then she had already left emotionally, already curled up in the arms of someone else. But she couldn't bring herself to terminate it, not after losing the first, not after feeling that kind of death inside her. And she told me she kept the pregnancy hidden until she moved out, until the first trimester passed, and by then she had made up her mind to raise the child without me, to let the man she was now with be the father regardless of biology, because she didn't think I would want to be involved, didn't think I would forgive her. And part of me wanted to scream right there in the middle of that little cafe, to pound the table and yell that she took everything from me, my right to choose, my child, my closure. But another part of me, the part that still loved her, in some quiet, unreachable way, knew it wasn't that simple, knew that pain does strange things to people, and fear twists logic into knots you can't untangle until it's too late. And I asked her, barely able to keep my voice from cracking, where is the child now? And she said softly, home, with us. And I felt my heart cave in, because I had a child, a living, breathing child, and I never knew, never got to hold them, never heard their first cry, never got to fall asleep with them resting against my chest, and now they were calling someone else Dad, someone who had never known the woman I once loved in the way I had, someone who stepped in after I was already written out of the story. And I whispered, is it mine? And she looked away, biting her lip so hard it turned white. And finally she said, I don't know, I never did a test, I was afraid. And in that moment, I hated her, not in the burning, vengeful way I expected, but in the hollow, grieving way that comes from realizing someone you trusted once with your whole heart had rewritten the ending of your life without asking. And I stood up, because I couldn't sit there anymore, couldn't breathe in the same air as her without drowning in what could have been. And she stood too, panicking, trying to explain, saying she thought she was protecting me, saying she didn't want to drag me into her chaos. And I said, you didn't protect me, you erased me. And she started crying, real tears, the kind that come from the gut, and people were staring now, but I didn't care. I was trembling, my fingers twitching as I tried to keep from screaming, and I asked her, what's their name? And she whispered at one soft syllable that felt like a brick to the chest, and I repeated it to myself, over and over like a prayer, because somehow, even if I never knew this child, even if I wasn't allowed to be there, that name was part of me now. And I asked, do they know about me? And she shook her head slowly, shame darkening her eyes. And I said, then you need to tell them, or I will. And she said, what if it's not yours? And I said, then I'll deal with that. But I deserve the truth, and so do they. And she looked like she was going to collapse. So I walked away before I could see her fall, because if I stayed, I might say something unforgivable, something that would make it impossible to ever be part of that child's life. And when I got home, I fell apart, completely, not just from heartbreak, but from the weight of everything I'd lost, a child, a choice, a version of my life that had been stolen from me under the disguise of peaceful separation. And the next morning, I called a lawyer, not to start a fight, but to understand my rights, because if there was even a chance that child was mine, I wasn't going to let another man raise them in my absence without at least trying to be part of their world. And days passed, sleepless and heavy, until finally she called me again and said she was willing to do a paternity test, and we scheduled it for the following week. And I remember the way my heart pounded the night before, thinking about all the possibilities, all the ways my life could tilt on this one piece of paper. And part of me prayed the child was mine, and part of me prayed they weren't, because I didn't know if I was strong enough to step into fatherhood under these circumstances. But when the results came in, I stared at the envelope for hours, not opening it, just holding it like it contained a bomb or a miracle. And when I finally tore it open and saw the word positive, I didn't cry, I didn't shout, I just sat down and whispered, I'm a father. And the room felt different after that, quieter, sacred in some way. And all I could think about was their face, their voice, the first time I would meet them, and how I would explain who I was, how I would try to be present without taking anything away. And I didn't know how to do it, but I knew I would, because now that I knew the truth, I couldn't live in peace until I became part of the life she tried to hide from me. Becoming a father to a child who had already learned to live without me was like trying to step into a story that had already been written, page after page filled with memories I wasn't part of, birthdays I didn't celebrate, first words I didn't hear, late nights I didn't rock them through. And I kept thinking about all the invisible versions of me that should have been there, me holding their tiny fingers for the first time, me picking them up from school, me whispering, I love you as they drifted off to sleep. But instead, all those moments belonged to someone else, a man who didn't look like me, think like me, love like me. but who had stood up when I didn't even know I was supposed to, and as much as I hated him for that, I also owed him something I could never say out loud. Because he loved a child that could have been a stranger, raised them with care, gave them a father when I wasn't even aware they needed one, and that kind of grace made it harder, not easier. Because it meant I wasn't stepping into a void, I was stepping into a full life, and I wasn't sure where I fit anymore, or if I even deserved to, but I kept showing up anyway. To the meetings, the mediation sessions, the quiet, tense coffees with her where we mapped out how to tell a child the truth about their beginnings without making them feel like a mistake or a prize to be fought over. And she was different now, more guarded, more exhausted, but I could tell she still cared about doing this right. Not for me, not for her, but for the little person who carried half of me in their DNA and none of me in their memories. And the day I met them for the first time, I thought I was ready, thought I had rehearsed every possible scenario, every word I'd say, every emotion I'd feel. But nothing prepares you for the moment your entire universe walks into a room in the form of a small, curious face that looks up at you like you're just another stranger. And that's what I was, a stranger, and it crushed me. But I smiled anyway. I knelt down and said, "Hi," and they blinked at me, shy but open, and said, "Hi," back. And in that single syllable, I felt something unearth itself in me, something primal and holy, like my soul recognized theirs even if they didn't know it yet. And over the next few weeks, we took it slow. Small visits, playground trips, picture books, and coloring pages. Moments where I could sit near them and just listen, just exist. And I kept waiting for them to ask why I was there, who I was. But kids are strange and beautiful that way. They often just accept what is, not because they understand it, but because they live so completely in the now. And eventually they started calling me by my name. Just my name. No labels, no pressure. But every time they said it, it felt like a gift. Like a crack of light in a room I thought would stay dark forever. And one day, they fell asleep in the car, and their tiny hand reached for mine in a dream. Instinctively. And I held it, just held it, tears slipping down my face silently as I sat there, memorizing the weight of it. The way their fingers curled into my palm like they belonged there. And in that moment, all the anger I had carried at her, at myself, at the world, started to let go. Not all at once, but enough to make room for something else, something better. And I realized I wasn't here to rewrite the past. I was here to build something new, something honest, even if it came late, and I didn't know what the future looked like. Didn't know if they'd ever call me dad, or if I'd always just be the other one. But that didn't matter anymore, because what mattered was being there now, showing up, loving without demand or resentment, and in time, things began to settle. Not perfectly, not magically, but steadily. And she and I, my ex-wife, found a rhythm, a way to co-parent that didn't require reopening every wound. And sometimes we even laughed again, small, tentative laughs that reminded me of the people we used to be before the weight of life pulled us under. And I'd be lying if I said I didn't still think about what might have been. What if I'd noticed sooner? What if we'd fought harder? What if we'd known how to grieve together instead of apart? But life isn't made of what ifs. It's made of what's here, what's now, and what's possible. And the truth is, I'll always carry a quiet ache for the years I lost. For the child I didn't know I had. For the version of myself that might have been a different kind of father. But I'm here now, imperfect, but present. And that has to be enough. And maybe, just maybe, one day, when my child is older and asks how it all happened, how a man they barely remember became someone who mattered, I'll tell them this story, not the polished version, not the fairy tale, but the real one, the one where love was messy and broken and painful, but never absent. And I'll tell them that the truth is sometimes hidden in silence, and sometimes peace comes only after you're brave enough to uncover the secrets left behind.